Okay, and the last lesson of this, we're going to talk about life in the colonies. Remember all the three sections. You have the New England colonies, you have the middle colonies, and you have the southern colonies. All right, and we're going to see how life is kind of organized in the colonies. Now, people in the colonies actually are pretty well off. I mean, they're healthier, they have more clean water, clean air, better food than the people in England. Actually, they're better off. They're actually bigger. They grow taller. They're probably heavier. But still, some of those holdovers from England, carry over to the colonies. And one of those is society and the standing in society. All right. In the colonies, there tend to be a little bit more social equality than in England, but still, that doesn't mean they believe that everybody is equal. They still have no problem with the idea that some people rank higher than others, right? And still, birth and wealth really still mattered. All right, who was your dad? Where did they come from? What's their family connection? How much money do they have? That still comes into play. So in the English colonies, you're going to see kind of a social structure, kind of like we saw with New Spain, the feudal system. There's kind of this hierarchy, and that still carried on even in colonial society, in the early colonial society. Okay, at the top of the heap, I'll get into this a little more detail on the next slide, but you had the gentry there at the top, followed by the middle class. Then next is the indentured servant, and finally at the bottom are slaves. And you'll notice that Native Americans aren't even mentioned. Okay, so the gentry. The gentry are the really well-off. They're the wealthy planters. They're the merchants. Remember those guys who are making a whole lot of money on the triangular trade? They're part of the gentry. Ministers. Remember the Anglican Church, highly educated, pretty well off. Lawyers and government officials. Remember, most of the government officials are appointed by the king or parliament. All right, so that's the top of the heap. That's the guys who are considered the most important, the most influential, and everybody would tip their hat to them, right? Because they're the gentry. But the biggest group is the middle class. The middle class, and these guys are doing all right. It's 3/4 of the population. 75% of all the people that live in the colonies are in the middle class. They include farmers who own their own land, skilled craftsmen, and some tradesmen. And you might wonder why this makes up such a big population, big portion of the population, I should say, is because land is plentiful. Land is cheap. So you can come over there. Do you think getting land in England is going to be easy? No, it's all owned by the nobility, right? But you can come to the New World and you can get land really inexpensively, and you're going to be able to make something of yourself, all right? The next group, and this is interesting to me, is the indentured servant. All right, these people are poor initially. They probably come from England, but they probably can't afford to even come to the New World because they're so poor. So what could I do? What can I do? Aha. There are people in the New World who need workers, all right? And they will pay for you to come to the colonies, all right? But you have to agree that you're going to work for them for 7 to 14 years in exchange for that transportation. Now, once you get to the New World, you're going to work for those people, like I said, from 7 to 14 years, and you're not getting paid. You're almost kind of like a slave. However, after that 7 to 14 year period, they would receive freedom dues. They're going to get a set of clothes, tools, and 50 acres of land. And guess what? A lot of those people are going to make something of themselves, and they're going to rise to the middle class, right? They had nothing in England. They are willing to sacrifice 7 to 14 years of their lives in exchange for that dream of the middle class, okay? And then finally at the bottom you have the slaves. They're mostly in the South, most on those large plantations. They kind of developed their own customs, especially in the South. A lot of the slaves did not even come into contact with a lot of white people, so they kind of developed their own customs, and kind of a blend of African and European cultures kind of develop. But they are going to be definitely at the bottom of the social status, and that's not going to change for quite some time. Okay, one thing we really need to talk about is the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening. If you remember back, a lot of these colonies, especially Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, started for religious freedom. All right? And, it's been like 100 years since this group have come over. They're long gone. Their children may have even died. And they start to drift away from their original teaching. So this religious movement starts in the 1730s and 1740s. And two very important ministers are at the head of this movement. One of them is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards has a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he asks people, especially young people, to kind of look at their lives, examine their lives. Are you doing what you should be doing? Are you serving God? All right? He warns them that if they are sinners, they're going to be in the hands of angry God and that they're going to be damned to hell for eternity. All right? So that really gets a lot of people to rethink, their religious teachings. The next guy is from England. His name is George Whitefield. He gives these huge outdoor revivals. And again, he really has people examine themselves and kind of turn away from their wicked deeds and their worldly affairs and turn back to God. But all that being said, there's a really important aspect of the Great Awakening. All right? Because of this preaching, many people begin to split away from their own church and form new churches. All right? Now, up until this time, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, kind of has a grip, especially on New England. And, these ministers are wealthy, they're highly educated, and they believe that only educated and well-trained people, should be teaching and preaching. All right? Now, these new people who have broken away from the church says, formal education is not as important as having, the spirit, the calling of God to teach. All right. So now it kind of forced people to become more tolerant of others' beliefs. But even more important is it kind of spreads this democratic feeling. Right. What I mean by that is they're like, hey, if we are smart enough to figure out our religious beliefs, if we can go and kind of figure out how we want to worship God, then maybe, just maybe, we can figure out how to govern ourselves. Maybe we don't need a king to tell us how to rule our lives. Right? So the Second Great Awakening really starts to open up not only a religious aspect, but also kind of the spirit of democracy and independence. Okay, now let's talk about the education in the colonies, all right? Now, up in New England, they are by far the most concerned about education of the people. Why? Because they believe that all people have the duty to study the Bible. And to study the Bible means that you must learn how to read and you must learn how to write, all right? So they start passing these laws that says that all towns with 50 or more families must hire a teacher. And the teacher is going to get paid, of course, with chickens and eggs and butter and cheese, whatever. All right? But towns with 100 or more families, not only did they have to have teachers, they had to build a grammar school to prepare boys to attend college. All right? So Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, sets up the first public school system, and it's funded by taxpayers. That means that every child can attend school. Doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor. You're all going to be able to attend school, get an education, because it's going to be funded by the taxpayers. All right? You have to remember this works pretty well up in New England because towns are close together. The people all live in villages. It's going to work out pretty well for the people in England. What about the middle and southern colonies? Well, let's look at that. Okay, if you remember back, I told you that in the middle, and especially in the southern colonies, these people aren't living in towns necessarily. Now you have some big towns in the middle colonies, if you think about New York, Philadelphia. But the rest of these people are kind of spread out on these pretty nice farms. Their nearest neighbor might be a mile or two away, maybe further. And in the south, they might be several miles away from their nearest neighbor. All right? So having schools necessarily in the town or village isn't going to work out so well. So in the middle colonies, churches and individuals kind of set up schools, but only the wealthy families could afford to send their children because they have to pay tuition. Okay? It's not publicly funded by taxpayers. So their schools are set up, but how you're going to pay for that is your family is going to pay. So only the wealthy in the middle colonies. Now people in the southern colonies, they are way too far from their neighbors. So the highly educated, the wealthy people in the south, they're going to either hire private tutors to come live in their house and teach their children, or they're going to send their children to Europe, mostly to England, to educate their children. All right? So kind of a whole different system depending on where you grew up in the colonies. Okay, another really important education system is the apprenticeship program. Apprenticeship. Now boys are going to be like 12 to 13 years old. They've been raised by their families. And now they're going to go, son, you need to learn a trade. You got to learn a skill. All right? I may not be able to, you might be the son of a farmer. And, what are you going to do? You don't have any farmland necessarily. You're going to go learn a skill. So you're going to get shipped off. You're going to be taken away from your family, and they're going to send you to work for maybe a blacksmith or a glassblower or a silversmith or a leather maker or a tailor or any number of, maybe a printer of crafts. And you're going to live with that family. Now that family and that master craftsman has an obligation to teach you to learn to read and write, to give you religious training, and to teach you a skill. Now, you're going to learn a lot, but you're not going to get paid. But once you reach about 18, 19, 20 years old, maybe even 21, you're going to be, a pretty accomplished tradesman. And you're probably going to have the skills to go and start your business. You're probably going to move to a different, village or town because, you don't want to compete with your master craftsman, the guy who taught you. But you're going to go and start your own business. So you're going to learn a skill. Now, that applies mostly to boys. Remember up in New England, most of the schools are teaching boys. So some New England girls would attend private schools called dame schools. All right, these are going to be in women's homes. They're going to teach them probably all the things that's necessary for a young woman to learn. Most of those dame schools are going to be for mostly wealthier young girls. They're going to learn how to, maybe host social functions and how to, all the manners and skills that a young woman would need. Maybe to get married off to one of the gentry class. But in reality, most women are going to learn, or most girls are going to learn what they need from their mothers and their grandmothers. How to sew, how to cook, how to bake, how to take care of a family. So most girls are not going to get a formal education. They're going to learn from their aunts, their grandmothers, their mothers. All right? Now the other thing that we need to talk about is kind of the spread of ideas. And the thing that's really catching hold in Europe, especially in France and England, is the Enlightenment. All right? The Enlightenment is an idea that they believe that reason and scientific method could be applied to the study of society. All right? So they look around and they say, how can we improve society? Now, the people who can afford to do that or think about that are going to be mostly the wealthy and highly educated. They're going to have more leisure time. They're going to have time to read books. They're going to have time to dabble in scientific experiments. Do you think a farmer trying to plow up a field and scratch out a living is going to be able to do that? No, it's really going to be the wealthy in the colonies. And probably the most famous of all is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin really only had 2 years of formal education. But he had a terrific mind. He got into printing. He did lots of experiments. He invented the bifocal lens, the Franklin stove. We all know about his studies with lightning. He becomes a world-famous scientist with very little education. But remember, because he believes in the scientific method, experiments, and this is an idea that begins to spread. And these are also going to be ideas not only how to improve society as far as new inventions. So it's going to be also the study of how can we improve our government. Is there a better way? Do we need a king? Do we need one guy to tell us how to run our lives? So the Enlightenment ideas spread not only the idea of maybe better quality of life as far as inventions, but also a better way of governing our lives. All right? So that's it. We have now covered chapter 3 or 4. That's going to be the first unit of the year, and hope you enjoyed it. The next time we meet, we're going to start talking about some problems that are going to start rising in the colonies. We're going to talk about the French and Indian War and problems that the colonies begin to have with their own mother country, England. We'll talk to you soon.